This is Chapter 7 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled Surprise. Death was furious. More than furious. He was downright livid. Standing in the blackness of the space between spaces, he finally found his destination, and with a flick of aspect magic, popped into being in a familiar location. Turning and looking both ways, he checked to make sure the coast was clear. When he saw it was, he pushed his hood back and undid the clasp of his cloak. His mortal body melted into being, and he coughed a little on the ashes. Always ashes in his mouth, every time he transformed. Huffing a little, he entered the barn. The Apple family barn was a large structure, brand new since the last one had been destroyed when Pinkamena had saved Apple Bloom from being crushed to death by its falling beams. The memory sent fresh, seething anger into the stallion. When he was sure the barn was empty, he lit a meager lamp and fiddled around in the darkness. Going into one of the tool stalls, he pawed around a little. Where was it? He'd hidden it here amongst Big Macintosh's tools, if only because, there. Death pulled out a long, tightly wrapped bundle and backed out into the great room of the barn. He'd hidden it there because, amongst the tools, it would look forgettable, and any pony that saw it would leave it be. It was the only place in Ponyville it was safe to store it, since Surprise had balls and other strange things hidden in all the other good hiding places. Dropping it on the ground, he leaned and undid the twine with his teeth. He'd put it away long ago, sure he'd never have to use it. Growling in frustration, when one bit of twine went up his nose, he turned wild for a moment and ripped the burlap wrappings away, tossing pieces in every direction. He stood over the object, panting. It gleamed terribly in the moonlight. Enough games. Pinkamena awoke in the dead of night, lifting her head slightly. She peered about the cool room, adjusting herself and sidling over to Lickety-Split's chest. Pressing her cheek to it, she heaved a great breath. His scent soothed her, and her eyes searched back and forth in the darkness. Had she been having a nightmare? Why was she trembling like that? She felt a drop of sweat work its way down her temple. Her stallion sensed movement and mewled softly in his sleep, his hooves crossing themselves around her neck and pulling her instinctively to himself. She pressed herself against him after she'd put her mane out of his eyes. Shuddering a little, she pulled the blankets up and shut her eyes again. Her nose started to itch. Her back left hoof went numb. She burped audibly. Her mane frizzed out for a moment. Her eyes crossed for a few seconds. Pinkamena moaned softly, then sat up, rubbing her hooves over her eyes. She furrowed her brow. Cocking her head, she analyzed internally what the pinky sense was telling her. Itchy nose, burp, mane frizzing, numb hoof, crossed eyes. That meant... Pinky! Wait, damn it. It's because the title of the chapter is Surprise. No, this is Lickety-Split talking. So, anyways. Pinky... Lickety-Split rolled over, searching needily to her. Stay, he moaned at the pink mare. I have to go, she whispered, more gently than she gave herself credit for, pushing him back and kissing his forehead. He whined wordlessly, but he'd not risen from sleep entirely to begin with. Stay here, I'll be careful. She shuddered suddenly and her ear flicked, and unsure why. Reaching, she made for the door. Stopping a moment, she got her saddlebag and slung it over herself. She looked over her shoulder at her stallion, frowning in a troubled way. Sighing a little, she reached and grabbed his scarf off of its peg on the wall. Wrapping it around her neck, she was satisfied. The winter would not bite as hard if she wore this. Making sure sleep had taken Lickety back to dreamland, she nodded to herself and stepped out into the night. The pink mare took off into the snowy darkness. the white powder crunching under her hooves as she clopped along as quickly as she dared without falling on ice. Winter rushed over her face and body, waking her up until her reflexes and mind caught up with her. Her features lowered themselves into a deadly scowl, her mane flapping in the wind as she skidded on a corner. Reaching out, she grabbed a signpost and swung it, flinging herself down the next street. Lowering her center of gravity on the ice, she slid along for quite a while. Then, she turned her body sideways and stopped in front of her destination. Sugar Cube Corner. She really didn't care to save the pony within that her pinky sense had warned her about. She'd taken her foalhood, taken her life, made her live in shadow. Surprise. Her sort of sister alternate half was the one due to die. There was a meager light on inside, which was unusual so late. The bakery usually closed at around 9 p.m., and it was well past midnight at that point, according to the Ponyville clock tower. Pinkamena narrowed her eyes and pushed the door open. The scent of all things sweet and savory assaulted her, turning her stomach. Shaking her head quickly, she stepped inside and flicked her eyes around. A white mare sat at one of the tables with a mug in her hooves, whiffing the steamy swirls of chocolatey goodness coming out of it. Pinkamena's back arched a little, suspicious. Where was the deadly situation? Where was the screaming, or the panic, or the deadly whatever it happened to be every time? Surprise? Pinkamena said cautiously. Surprise's eyes flicked up and filled with joy. Pinkamena! You came just like he... Pinkamena dove face first and skidded on the tiles as a flash of silvery death arched in front of her. She slid a few feet, somersaulted backwards, and miraculously ended up on all her hooves. Death stood just to one side of the entrance, a massive scythe having gone through the door and blasted rivulets of wood out onto the sidewalk. It was a trap. Death had come to threaten Surprise, but Surprise was part of herself. She tried to work out the logic of the pinky sense for a moment, but a kaleidoscope of cosmic chaos assaulted her brain, so she stopped. Quiet, imbecile, she told her lesser half, scowling as Death stood in the doorway. He turned slowly, the scythe's shaft held in his teeth. The light was not enough to expose his face, but a good look at his hooves compared to the size of the tiles he stood on confirmed. He was an enormous pony. New toy? She asked Death as he straightened to face her. I don't think there's anyone named Imbecile here, Pinkamena. Sorry. Hard to tell the dialogue. I don't think there's anyone named Imbecile here, Pinkamena, Surprise said helpfully from the table, seemingly frozen to her chair. Should I go looking for some pony to... Shut up! Pinkamena barked over her shoulder, just in time for Death to make a mad rush at her. She reared up, weaving past chairs and tables as the scythe flashed back and forth. It rang with the tinkling sound of falling iron shavings, and wherever it went it left destruction. Chairs broke apart, tables smashed into themselves, display cases with confections inside hesitated, then fell into halves. She bucked wildly when one of the arcs was over, kissing his cheek with her back hooves. She grunted audibly, using his massive weight as momentum. Even from where she was sitting, Surprise could see the little hoofful of pink mane hairs flying. The pink mare recoiled, a slash of her curtain-like mane gone. She was perhaps 4 inches shorter now, and could no longer hide her expression from the world when she ducked her head. Seething, she coiled herself as she skidded a bit on the slick tiles. Death stopped a moment, brandishing the long-shafted weapon. It seemed so unwieldy, but he raced it back and forth with ease. It had a long, black wooden shaft with a curved blade. Decorated across it were runes and skull symbols, glinting with a red-purple finish in the candlelit. Ooh, mahogany. Fancy, Pinkamena jeered. Death snarled savagely, then rushed forth while the tip of his weapon sprayed sparks across the floor. Surprise's hooves leapt up to her ears at the horrible claws on a chalkboard sound it made. Pinkamena was running out of furniture to hide behind, rushing back and forth, but always retreating. Only Surprise's table and chair seemed immune, for they didn't dance around it. The pink mare flung herself forward in a moment of madness, under and past the arc of the blade. Grabbing on with her forelegs, she wrapped herself around the bizarre weapon and headbutted him without thinking. They both grunted in pain, but neither let go. Struggling back and forth with her, Death suddenly gave the shaft a clicking twist and pulled the spear free. A weapon within a weapon. Pinkamena reeled dangerously, and the dark stallion rushed upon her, knocking her onto her back with a flail of her hooves. Leaping with all his massive stallion weight, he slammed his hooves down upon her. She cried out, feeling the ribs break as he did so. Strong. He was so strong. Wasting no more time, and in the heat of the anger-fueled passion of battle, Death stabbed her through the chest with a flourish. Blood exploded from the wound, and Pinkamena cried out in agony. She squirmed beneath him as he twisted the weapon savagely. She yelped, pooling blood about herself as she tried to struggle like an insect on a needle display. Something deep within her burst, and her back arched as the pain no longer let her scream. She twitched, feeling herself going limp with weakness while the floor of Sugar Cube Corner slowly stained itself an inky red. "No," she gagged out, splattering her chin with blood. Her hooves reached up, meekly trying to pull the weapon from her breast. Death twisted again, holding her down as she screamed out from the torture. It tore her throat raw. "Surprise! Run!" she whimpered, reaching towards her twin with a wavering and blood-covered hoof. "Run away!" She gagged hard, and her vision started to tunnel. She panted, clutching desperately at her chest. Surprise was staring at the scene with an expression of awe and terror. Standing over his conquest with a massive hoof to hold her down, Death pulled his hood back with a black chuckle. Lickety-split. Pinkamena awoke with a terrorized, full-throated scream. Sitting up in bed, she tore her throat out with a belting shriek. Lickety-Split snapped awake, screamed too, and fell out of bed with a howl of fear. What is it?" He flailed wildly, caught in the twists of the sheets and pillows. She looked over at him when she ran out of breath, tears streaking down her cheeks. She could hear herself panting in the darkness while they stared at each other. Lickety-Split stared at her sweaty, shaking form. "Oh, Pinkamena," he said, reaching out once he'd untangled himself, slowly moving up onto the bed again. He held her. She flinched lightly, but did not pull from him. She even let the pinky bit pass, which told him volumes. "This is starting to get to you, all this death business," he whispered, stroking her mane over and over. She didn't respond, didn't look at him, only pressed herself into his strong chest while she shook like a leaf. There in the darkness, Pinkamena could think of little but her stallion and the horrible visions she'd had. Was it just a nightmare? Was the Pinky Sense trying to tell her something? Was Lickety-Split? No, of course not. Lickety was much smaller than Death. Death was a massive stallion. Her dreams had warped all of the shapes and sizes of the things around her. It wasn't true. She pressed herself harder into him, almost pushing him off the bed entirely. She was grateful to see her mane, uncut, hanging over her eyes and face. The hard-edged mare could never remember being so completely terrified. I love you," she whispered to him. Lickety stopped, deeply touched, staring at the top of her head for a long time. He pressed his lips into her mane. "I have something for you," he whispered at last, leaning to his side of the bed. Stretching, he got into the bedside table drawer and drew out a little box. He looked a bit nervous, but set his jaw and went on. "I was gonna wait, but I think this'll cheer you up." Spooning up behind her, he flipped it open. Pinkamena flinched at the golden sparkle that twinkled in the moonlight as he unveiled an engagement hoof-hoop. "I want to marry you," he whispered into her ear, leaning to nibble on it a little. The pink mare stared at it, an icy quiver going through her shapely frame. It glittered invitingly. Her mouth went a little agape, and she couldn't form words. I... His steady hooves leaned and took her right front hoof, raising her leg a bit. He took it gently from the box, and the cool metal touched her while he nuzzled her neck romantically. "I can't!" she suddenly shrieked, pulling her hooves up and under her chin, tearing away from him. She fled the bedroom. "For all I know, you could be him!" she cried and dashed away. Lickety-Split was frozen on the spot, his mouth a little agape. The engagement hoof fell from his teeth, spun upon the hardwood floor, then went silent when it settled. The poor stallion was crushed. "We must admit we did not expect such interesting results. Thou should asketh me to send nightmares to ponies more often. Her terrors of thou are deep-seated now." Princess Luna and Death lingered in the space between spaces, having just watched the scene unfold. The infinite blackness stood on the lip of the great beyond, just on the cusp of the location souls traversed before heading forward in the great cycle of souls. Though it is interesting she seeks your identity now, not just to stop you. She understands that you're mortal. A clattering of teeth was all the stallion said, nodding a few times in assent. Careful with his hood and cloak, he shifted his weight a little and scratched his skeletal chin with a hoof the size of a dinner plate. "Is that thy aspect weapon there under your cloak, or art thou merely glad at my presence?" The goddess of the moon smirked at him, her eyes flicking down. If he'd had eyes in his sockets, he would have rolled them. Sultry thing. He shifted the lip of his cloak a bit lower, then reached into its depths. A flash of silver sent an arc of aspect magic bolting wildly across the ethereal landscape like lightning on the storm. Death's scythe. "Thou art a show-off," Luna chuckled darkly, and he sagged in annoyance as she took it from him for a moment. She looked it over, making sure the shaft was straight, the blade sharp, and the power still mightily endowed. "We have not seen it in decades, Death's scythe." She smiled a bit. "Forged from a pure, silvery moonbeam, tempered into physical form, it is still one of our finest and deadliest weapons. I do not know why Celestia insisted on giving the other aspects such useless tools." She rolled her eyes a little. Princess Celestia had given Father Time a sort of booth that could go back and forth in time, and Mother Nature had received a crown that could tame even the wildest beasts. Such silly things. "So, now thou know'st she does not think she can best you in mortal combat. Her dreams betray this. Wilt thou go to slay her in real life?" Death nodded without hesitation. "What did you learn, dear Father Time?" Celestia mused over her teacup at him. Dr. Hooves took off his bow tie and his aspect powers winked out. He blinked into existence at the little garden picnic table, startling the guards. He was struggling to even hold his teacup now, a little scowl of concentration on his face. It was as though the hooves meant nothing to him. She watched him work it back and forth, completely inept with their use. Eyeing his frustrated gaze, the Sun Princess giggled when he elected to stick his face into his teacup instead and rudely slurp. He had the decency to pinken in the cheeks, and he apologized profusely. Magic enveloped his cup, and she gently tilted it at him. Feeling like a toddler, he leaned and sipped a little. "Still getting used to that form, I see," she whispered privately. Quite," Dr. Hooves said. Anyway," he launched into his report, telling her of everything that he'd seen Luna and Death speak about. "Doesn't seem right, spying on my colleague and all. Little underhanded, underhoofed, you know," he said, gesturing in little circles with his hooves. Looking down, he reached and adjusted his crimson bow tie. "He's never bothered in my vocation, time-jumping and such. Almost made me think I was boring, just once. Never crossed my mind again, but the once was bad. Made me feel a little bad about myself, really." The short little burst phrases that he spoke in were all part of his charm. "I'm afraid a few too many bad things are in motion, my little pony," Celestia sighed softly. "While it's always my intention to stay out of the affairs of my subjects and let them sort out their own lives, when the aspects or my sister are involved, it becomes my concern as well." She looked a little crestfallen at all the new details about Death going after Pinkamena directly. There was a long silence between them, for Dr. Hooves had no idea what to say to such things. Several aided sips of tea later, the aspect of time was the first one to speak. "Princess, will you be interfering, then?" he said, looking a little tired and resolved to any horror that might come of it. His teacup quivered in the air for just a moment, and the doctor saw the brief fleck of distress on the princess's face. It vanished into its normal serene look after that split moment, though. "Do you know what makes an excellent goddess, Dr. Hooves?" Celestia smiled bemusedly. She sat on her haunches, a little more in an upright fashion. He cocked his head at her, giving her questions with his eyes. "Helping to keep the balance? If, at the end of the day, no pony can tell if you are even pulling the strings." It was a cryptic answer, and his brow furrowed with even more questions. Finally, he gave in and smiled at her, trying to put his faith in the sun goddess. She'd run Equestria so beautifully so far. She would know precisely what to do when the moment came. This is Chapter 8 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled Intermission. Pinkamena sat, hovering over a little mountain of French fries. She'd already killed 2 piles, and this was her third. The straining taste of salt helped to soothe her woes. She'd wandered the chilling night with nowhere to go until the day came, then settled into a little Ponyville diner, grateful to just find some place to sit. The look on Lickety-Split's face was burned into her mind. "More ketchup," she called to a passing waiter, a young stallion with little pox on his face. Are you sure? You've been here since we opened, and—" She grabbed him by his stupid little diner collar. "I mean, sure thing, I'll get right on that." He laughed nervously, cantering away quickly. Pinkamena grumbled to herself, resting her chin tiredly on the table and stuffing another French fry in her mouth. "Oh my, sweet Celestia!" some pony outside the big panel window shrieked, making Pinkamena's eyes flick over. She saw she was being stared at by none other than Rarity. The pale unicorn made a beeline off the sidewalk into the diner and to her table. "Pinkamena, darling, you look terrible," she declared. The pink mare's eyes lidded as her eyebrows gathered angrily, scowling at her. "What happened? You look like you haven't slept a wink." They shared a silence, as Rarity expected her to say something. She didn't, only deepened her scowl. "Did something happen? Are you sick?" The unicorn's eyes moved over her table and her brow went up. Is that all French fries?" she asked, a little dumbfounded. Pinkamena nodded, and right then the young stallion showed up with her ketchup. She splattered the red stuff all over her plate, stuffing more into her mouth. Rarity watched in a rather repulsed silence for a long time. "What?" the pink mare finally said. "That's pity food if I ever saw it." Rarity smiled a little sympathetically, sliding into the booth across from her and stealing a fry before Pinkamena could stop her. "Come to drown your sorrows for something?" She cocked her head a little, leaning on the table a bit. The pink mare scowled at her for being read so thoroughly. She didn't answer once again. "Well, you know," Rarity was digging through her saddlebag, "I was saving these for a weekend with Fluttershy, but I think you need them more right now." She smiled, levitating a pair of magenta tickets out. They were sales tickets to the local spa. One of Pinkamena's eyebrows rose. "Well, you just look so tense and distressed. I think you could use a good pampering. Come along." Pinkamena felt a pressure on her back, and a phantom hoof of a Rarity's magic brought her to her hooves. She followed slowly. "I suppose. Besides, you can't just sit and eat fries all day. It'll all go straight to your hips." The backhanded compliment was followed quickly by Rarity's awkward smile. But anyway, come along, we'll go right now." Pinkamena had been stewing in the hot bath for almost an hour when she finally spoke of her own volition. "Lickety-Split proposed to me," she said, as though tasting the phrase. Rarity's face turned questioning, and her eyes flicked down to Pinkamena's right foreleg. No engagement hoop there. "And I'm guessing you turned him down, darling?" she asked, shifting a little in the steamy water. "No engaged mare wears that scowl if she said yes." The pale unicorn sunk up to her neck, waiting for Pinkamena to say more. "Go ahead, tell Auntie Rarity all about it." Pinkamena hesitated for a long time. Truth be told, she hadn't done much connecting with the main six. After she'd separated, or tried to, from Surprise, she thought she would just leave the blonde mare to be the new Pinkie Pie. But no, now and then, Applejack or Twilight, or one of the others would come by the ice cream parlor to chat with her. But she was usually gruff and sent them away. Maybe this was an opportunity for more. "I dreamed that Death was lickety-split. I thought the Pinky Sense was warning me about his identity," she said finally. Rarity gasped, looking horrified and putting a hoof over her mouth. Pinkamena stared at the bubbling waters. "I need to know who Death is before it makes me crazy." "Rainbow Dash told me that Death was a large stallion, a great big one." Rarity gestured to make a wide motion. "Forgive me for saying, but Lickety-Split is... She struggled to find a delicate way to put it, and took far too long. "Smaller?" Pinkamena offered a time, giving a smirk. "Not to question his virility or anything, he's just rather spindly in the ankles, if you know what I mean." Rarity turned a little pink in the cheeks. Pinkamena stared at her. "Did you turn him down because you don't love him?" she asked, while the steam curled back and forth around their faces. "No, that's not it," Pinkamena said softly, stirring the water with one hoof. "I don't want to let my guard down is all. Suppose it was him. My wedding night could be my tomb." "You work at his parlor. You live together. I assume you sleep together." Rarity let the sentence hang awkwardly for a moment, then quickly amended. In the same bed, I mean. If he was death, he would have had plenty of opportunity to get rid of you. Weren't you sick recently? He might have, I don't know, made the germs kill you? No pony would have No pony would have suspected a thing. Pinkamena knew she had a good point and sighed. If anything, Lickety had been her stalwart white knight while the pressure kept increasing and increasing in her situation. Then she'd snapped at him at the most tender of moments. Rarity watched her fight a long, internal battle, a little pout on her lip. By the time they'd moved to the massage tables, and Pinkamena had been coaxed that there was nothing wrong with another mare rubbing on her body, the pink mare was ready to say more. I feel as though it's coming to a head. I don't know what to do. Each time is more deadly than the last. Rarity groaned when an impressive maneuver made 3 parts of her back crackle like popcorn. Aloe, one of the 2 massage therapists, smiled serenely when her customer cried out like she did. Masochist? Hopefully not. Aloe's twin, Vera, was massaging Pinkamena's scalp with both hooves. The pink mare laid her head down with a deep sigh, allowing a quiet murmur of pleasure. Will we be doing this main time... Oh, dang it. This is a French one. Out of nowhere. Alright, here we go. Will we be doing main this time as well, Madame Rarity? Aloe asked in a wispy voice. Oh, yes, please. Pinkamena cast a dark gaze at Vera, who knew without asking there would not be any touching the pink mare's mane with any utensils today. Her massage worked down across her temples, which understandably ached. She moaned like her arm was being twisted. Fine, just a little trim, to make the edges even, she murmured, looking at the floor with darkened cheeks. Rarity smiled encouragingly. But nothing else? Got it. Vera nodded, ever the quick and silent servant. While the minutes passed, Rarity was done up in about 17 curlers, and Pinkamena was seen to with a tiny pair of precision scissors. You know what I think you should do, Pinkamena? Rarity said a little haughtily, eyes closed as she was done up with green face goo and cucumber slices. The pink mare rolled her eyes. No, she didn't want to know, thank you. I think you, after all this, you should start looking at all the stallions in Ponyville. Lickety-Split is my stallion, Rarity. How dare you? Pinkamena barked blackly. Vera flinched back, not wanting to trim any hair while her customer was shouting animatedly. No, 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 Rarity said, chortling along with Aloe, who was busily putting her mane in a nice beehive-shaped bun. I mean, if you want to learn who Death is, and he's got a physical shape, why don't you look around and see who fits the shape? Pinkamena flicked her eyes at Vera, trying to stay still so she could be trimmed. To be honest, Big Macintosh is the only stallion I know of that's that big, she said, gesturing vaguely. A great big barrel chest, a deep voice, and massive hooves. There's not many ponies that fit that description. Big Macintosh? Rarity chuckled aloud. That poor country bumpkin couldn't hurt a fly, much less be a shepherd of the dead. She tilted her head in thought, trying to come up with another suspect. Well, there's Prince Blueblood in Canterlot. Goodness knows the behavior would fit. Her old grudge began to rear its ugly head. Or Dr. Hooves. He always seems to be popping in and out at places of very strange intervals. I wouldn't be surprised if there was something supernatural to that pony, she hummed as she thought about the theory. What about Fancy Pants, Jelly Belly? Some pony from Appaloosa, maybe. Those cart stallions that we chased Applejack with were huge. Or even... She rattled down a list of names, none of which made much sense. Pinkamena sighed. No matter which way she cut it, the only suspects on the list didn't make any sense. While it was a wise pony that said, eliminate the impossible and whatever's left must be true, she didn't have enough evidence. You know, worst case scenario, Rarity said softly, turning her head even though her eyes were covered with cucumber slices. It's no one we know at all. A total strange pony. Yeah, Pinkamena mumbled, lying still until Vera was done trimming her mane. Whatever she'd admitted it or not, she did feel a bit better after all of this pampering. She felt cleaner, lighter, more relaxed than she had in a long time. You know what you ought to do, Rarity chirped, a second time, making Pinkamena fight down a groan. This mare was too gossipy, too concerned with other ponies' business. I think you should go home and talk to Lickety. He's probably hurting, darling. Her tone had turned somber and a little sad. You know better now. Perhaps you can patch things up? Pinkamena said nothing, but mumbled her assent. She'd been dreading going back home. You know Lickety can't be death in stature. He's far too small, though it wouldn't tell him that. She chuckled conspiratorially. It might hurt his poor little ego. Pinkamena smiled a smile that made both Aloe and Vera shiver from an unseen cold. Lickety Split was banging around in one of the side rooms when Pinkamena arrived at home. It had been a storage room, but all the boxes had been shoved to one side and he was constructing what looked like a couch futon. Screwdriver in his mouth and an unfolded paper of instructions nearby, he almost didn't see her in the doorway. Pinkamena, he said a little cautiously. She leaned into the room, smelling the burning sea salt candle hidden in the corner somewhere. What are you doing? She asked, peering with a frown. I don't think we should sleep together anymore, he said, looking away. Even from the distance where he stood, she could see his eyes wear a little bloodshot from excessive crying. She opened her mouth to speak, but she saw the shrill anger rise up in him again. I'm good enough to mount, but not enough to marry? How dare you? He shouted at her, making her lean back and lift a hoof like she might bolt. His words cut deep. You can sleep in here, separate from now on. This is your room, he told her angrily, turning back to the futon with a sniffle-strained huff. Lickety, Pinkamena reached towards him, but he flinched when she touched his back. Taking a deep breath, the rather jaded mare knew now was the time to open up, if ever there was one. If she wanted a companion now that her new life was blossoming, she needed to take good care of him. I'm sorry about last night. I had a terrible nightmare, and I saw Death's face was yours, she said, coming and settling on her belly next to him. He very carefully didn't look at her, but wasn't putting screws into the futon anymore. His breath was shuddering and upset. She sidled until their sides were pressed together. Then you proposed while I was still freaking out, and I thought I would be letting my guard down if it really was you, she confessed quietly, sticking her muzzle into his mane to nuzzle him apologetically. No, apple spice. Some kind of apple mane and body wash product from Sweet Apple Acres. Pinkamena's nose wrinkled angrily. Pinky, Lickety turned when she rose with a snap of her knees and stomped away. The stallion looked at the tools and screws and metal parts strewn around the room. Sighing depressedly, he slowly rose to his hooves. He made his way across the room to the doorway to see what she had gone to do. Was she going to pack up and move out? Where would she go? How would she make a living? Would she... Splat! Lickety Split let out a high-pitched, mare-like shriek as an ice cream bucket was slammed over his head. Vanilla ice cream splattered over his face, neck, mane, and down his chest. He staggered back and forth, hit a wall, and fell comically. His hooves bicycled about in the blinded, chill-induced panic. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the blindness ended when Pinkamena lifted the ice cream bucket off of him. She stared down at him, dripping from his face and mint-green mane. "Sorry, my stallion smells like vanilla," she told him, throwing the bucket aside. "He smells like a mare, but he's still my stallion." There was a long silence while he stared at her, sticky and blinking in shock. "But I'll marry you after I conquer death," Pinkamena said, lying down on her belly before him, leaning with all the subtlety of a minotaur in a china shop. She ran her tongue erotically over his cheek. "Promise," she said after smacking her lips a few times, thoughtful. His face lit up joyfully, a massive grin wrapping itself across his face. "Oh, Pinky, that's great. I'll just get a shower and we can go out to celebrate." The pink mare grabbed his chin and hauled him dominantly down onto his belly again, at her level. "It's Pinkamena. And nope," she said, leaning and licking his face again. "You're gonna stay right here." Her look of dominant masochism crossed her face, and she soon held him by the shoulder. "Right here," she said in a husky sort of whisper, licking along his mane. The stallion gasped aloud, despite himself. "For all I know, that scent needs to ferment to stick to you." He smiled in helpless embarrassment when she tasted him, his cheeks coloring a lovely crimson. As white as he was, it made his cheeks look like he had twin cherries on his face. Cherries on a sundae, like his cutie mark. This pleased Pinkamena. Lickety-Split had no shower that night, though he did end up clean. After his mare was done convincing him he should always smell like vanilla, that is. Silly stallion. This is Chapter 9 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled Hoofprint. "Now this, my boy, is going to help us plow and till the fields 10 times faster than ever before. Us apples are lucky for being able to test the prototype for this fancy machine," said Papa Apple, Big Macintosh's father. The young stallion, just a foal at the time, looked up at his father and smiled grandly. "Yep, with a thing like this, I reckon we could expand Sweet Apple Acres 10 times over if we wanted to." Big Macintosh leaned over the side, looking at the spinning, whirling blades that were blasting away at the soil. It turned it, mulched it, dug deep to draw out the moisture and fertile minerals, then dropped it right back down again in even rows. "You know, the apples have always been doing things by hoof, but I don't see any harm in trying something new now and then," said Papa Apple. "Your mother don't approve, of course, but I reckon us stallions are out in the fields most of the time anyway, doing the heavy work." He snickered with his young son. "So we should have some say in how things get done around here." Big Macintosh laughed gaily, nodding up and down. It was only out in the fields that he and his father had time to be buddies, and every hard day's work left him with more nuggets of wisdom. The colt reared up, looking over the railing again to watch the machine work. His father worked the complicated levers, leaning over an instruction manual as thick as a phone book. Now and then, the machine would kick up a big rock, and long mechanical arms would rush down to grasp it and toss it aside. It would make the machine kick a little, but the 2 ponies held on just fine. What do you reckon this field will be, Pa?" the foal wanted to know, gesturing grandly over all the freshly tilled soil they'd already created. Corn, I reckon, or maybe wheat. We haven't done wheat in a while." "Not more apple trees?" "Well, no pony ever survived on just apples. You gotta diversify to do well in life." The stallion smiled down at his son, hanging on when the machine kicked up another rock. He looked so small, but he'd grow big and strong, just like his father. The Apple family tended to produce massive stallions, to the point where their midwives knew to have whiskey on hoof, and their farm work only made them bigger and stronger. Holding on to the raised seat he was strapped to, Papa Apple turned the steering wheel rapidly. The many-toothed machine gave a groan, turning slowly as it went to cut another swath in the earth. He pulled a steam valve that hung on a pole chain. That made Big Macintosh laugh, prancing about the deck of the contraption. The machine kicked again, much harder than before, flinging both ponies to the railing and sending Big Macintosh right over the edge. The machine had struck some sort of boulder, hidden under the surface of the earth, and had stutter-stopped it. He squealed in terror, holding onto the edge of the deck with his tiny hooves. "Papa!" he cried out. Papa Apple rushed to his son's aid while the machine bucked and whined and hissed out steam at all different angles. "Hang on!" he shouted, leaning under the railing and over his son's head. He grabbed Big Macintosh by his tiny yoke, grunting with effort and using only his teeth. He swung his foal onto the deck again with a rush of powerful strength. Both of them lay there panting, while the machine vibrated harder, threatening to throw them both off of itself. "I gotta shut it down. Hang on to something," the Apple patron roared while his son clung fearfully to a stray mechanical pipe. "Be careful, Papa," Big Macintosh whimpered, trembling and holding on to his anchor with all his might. The machine bucked wildly while the stallion crawled back to the control panel. Just then it gave a terrifying sound of something deep inside bursting. The foal's anchor pipe suddenly ruptured, jagged metal flying across his neck. He whinnied in agony, the desperate recoil dragging the pipe's edge across his vocal cords, down his little chest and across his little undercarriage. A shadow passed over Big Macintosh. It was his father being flung through the air. He saw him going over the side. The sounds of the machine's tilling teeth ripping his body spattered the air, and a great fountain of blood rushed like a wave up onto the deck of the machine. His screams would haunt Big Macintosh for the rest of his life. Barely alive, the little red foal staggered to the control panel, using the last of his strength to pull himself into the raised seat. Falling over all the buttons and dials, it was all he could do to pull the key. The machine died, the earth-tilling teeth and robot arms grinding to a halt. Blood waterfalled from his splayed-open neck and chest. Big Macintosh laid his head down on the steering wheel to die. Big Macintosh woke with a grunt, his chest itching furiously. He sat up, scratching wildly at the massive scars hidden under his fur. Panting a little, he rubbed the sweat from his forehead and checked the clock. He was up 5 minutes early. He heaved a great, shuddering breath, rubbing his eyes before he rose from bed. He hardly ever dreamed of that day anymore, but it always made him so itchy. Leaning in an aching way, he found his hooves and went about his normal morning rituals before going to check on his sisters. Apple Bloom was curled up in her little bed, cute and innocent as could be. Her crude bits of artwork were strewn all about the room, plans for she and her best friends to find their cutie marks. The stallion vowed to laugh the day she got a cutie mark that was for finding cutie marks. What would that be? A blank flank on her flank? He smirked good-naturedly. The stallion got a bit of surprise when he peeked in on Applejack, mainly because she wasn't alone in her bed. A quick check of the rainbow-colored mane and wings sticking out was all it took to know the guest's identity. He frowned a little disapprovingly. His sister was a filly-fooler, huh? Groaning inwardly and rolling his eyes, he gently closed the door. She'd bring it to light later and they'd have to sort it out. He couldn't say the idea made him very comfortable. He'd just forget about it for now. Peeking in at Granny Smith was always interesting, for her position when she found sleep was often unusual. That day, Big Macintosh found her with her head at the wrong end of the bed, and all of her pillows in different corners of the room. How? Why? There was no telling. It was one of those Apple family mysteries. Seeing all the mares in the household were still asleep, the barrel-chested stallion went downstairs to start a meager breakfast. Winter though it was, there was still lots to be done on the farm. He had a fence or two to repair, and he wasn't quite done sharpening all the tools in the barn. It was best to get that done during the winter, so it was one less thing to worry about during the warm months when the planting and harvesting was going on. He opened the door to go outside, a lantern in his mouth to light the way to the barn. He reared a little when he saw a figure standing on the porch waiting for him, holding a lantern a little higher. He exposed pink fur and a curtain-like mane. He blinked in shock, letting his face do the talking since his throat hurt him when he spoke. "Good morning to you too, Big Macintosh," Pinkamena said with a toss of her mane, smiling a rather chilly smile. "Up early to do chores as usual. Your sisters and the rest of the family must be proud." The last word in her sentence was rather poisonous, making the red stallion's eyes narrow a little. What was she up to? "No doubt you're headed to the barn or something. Can I walk with you?" Big Macintosh slowly nodded, already on edge and suspicious about her intentions. They walked in silence, the icy silence of the wee hours of the winter morning harboring no insects or other sounds. The clip-clop of their hooves on stepping stones and then gravel was the only sound between them for a time. Big Mac pushed the barn door open with his nose, glancing over Pinkamena's shoulder. He was glad to have led the strange mare away from his family. If she was going to have a meltdown or something, he didn't want her near his kin. Setting the lantern on a hook, he turned to face her at last. She made a point of closing the door behind them. A slight breeze pressed on the barn, and the slightest motion of hooves crunched hay loudly. Big Macintosh cocked his head at her, motioning for her to speak. "I know your secret, Big Mac," Pinkamena blurted, finally, unable to hold herself back any longer. His brow rose in surprise. Then again, it wasn't that hard to figure out. She started pacing back and forth. "The stallion with massive hooves and a deep voice and incredible strength. Who else could it have been here in Ponyville?" Big Macintosh felt color coming to his cheeks, a deeper red than normal. He lifted a hoof, leaning back a bit suddenly. She was in his face, and he startled back a little. "Admit it, Big Macintosh! It can't be any pony else!" she roared accusingly. Beads of sweat went down either side of his face, and he looked everywhere but her. "Not so tough without your cloak, are you?" She rushed at him with the whinny of a battle. "All right, I admit it," he rasped out, lifting a hoof to shield his face. "I confess." His throat practically caught fire, and he scratched at himself furiously. The pink mare skidded to a halt, sure she had her enemy in his corner now. "Then hoof it over," Pinkamena demanded, the source of Death's transformation powers, his magical cloak. She'd seen him do it enough times. She'd figured it out. "Hoof it over and we can end this once and for all." She was very proud of herself. Not only had she caught him off guard, but apparently racked with guilt. This was going to be easier than she thought. "All right. I keep it here. You can have it, I promise." Big Macintosh coughed throatily, tormented with the pain of speaking. He leaned on one of the beams of the barn for a moment, catching his breath so he didn't lose a lung. Speaking hurt him enough, but doing so while upset was just torturous. Pinkamena scowled, staying very close so he wouldn't try any funny business. She followed the crimson stallion into one of the barn stalls. It was loaded down with drawers and drawers of things, screws, wedges, nails, corks, small tools, anything that could be bought in bulk and usually had one use. The pink mare silently applauded his hiding place. Even if someone went looking for Death's cloak here, it would be hours before they found it. She was tense, though, poised for battle. If he came at her with a scythe or something like in her dreams, it would actually be best to be quite close to him. A long-reaching, swinging weapon was useless against a pony that was within Hoof's reach, in a tactical sense. She'd thought long and hard about it, and even bopped him on the flank when he hesitated. The big stallion flinched like she'd struck him, ears turned back. He leaned high, silently counting drawers so he could find the right one. "Hurry it up," she snapped, keeping him on the rope so he wouldn't gain any last-moment confidence and try something. Big Macintosh counted 4 drawers down, 3 to the left, then 7 more down, then 4 to the right. Placing his mouth over the ringlet of the drawer, he pulled it open and reached inside. Turning, he gave it to her. A Smarty Pants doll. "Don't tell Twilight," the stallion rasped pathetically, his eyes big and soft. If Pinkamena had been an anime character, she would have fallen directly onto her head in a pratfall. He placed it on the floor in front of her, looking humiliated and ashamed. "What the fuck is this?" Pinkamena grabbed the doll up, turning it back and forth like it was a puzzle box. "A raggedy doll? This isn't Death's cloak!" She pelted him with it cruelly. Big Macintosh flinched like she'd struck him with a rock, quickly picking up the precious object and cradling it gently. Whatever Pinkamena was after, it wasn't Smarty Pants. Thank Celestia. Pinkamena reared up, putting both hooves on his massive shoulders. "You listen here, Big Mac!" She swatted the doll from his hooves, her patience having run out by now. His face was shocked as she put her muzzle to his, until he looked at the poor doll laying limp on the ground. Big Macintosh gave a rough, snorting sound, pushing her back. "Nope." He was already reverting to his usual 2-word vocabulary. She was losing her grip on him. She could practically see his internal shields coming up, and an angry glare was sealing up any cracks in his defenses. A hoof the size of a dinner plate pushed her, digging her hooves in, all the way out of the stall and out of the barn. They stared at each other for a long time, both angry. Some hidden line had been crossed between them. "Nope," he said again, slamming the door in her face. Pinkamena stood there for a long time, then peeked into the barn through a crack. The massive stallion was sitting on his haunches, holding the doll with both front hooves, rubbing his cheek against it. The pink mare had never been more confused. She stepped backward in the snow a few times, brow furrowing in angry frustration. She stared down at her hooves, then her chest. She stopped a moment, blinking. Big Macintosh's hoofprint was on her breast, as clear as day. Tracking snow into the barn and across hay and dirt had made mud. A slow, rather chilling smile worked across her face. She had Big Macintosh's hoofprint. "Twilight Sparkle." Pinkamena was knocking on the library door with her face, or her forehead, rather. She didn't want to reach up with a hoof and risk wrinkling her pristine evidence. "Twilight Sparkle," she called more loudly. The sun was barely rising, having just cleared the horizon and slowly laboring its way into the sky. Twilight came to the door looking very frizzy in the main, having been pulled from a wonderful con man spy pony dream. "Pinkamena," the lavender librarian said drowsily, eyeing her up and down. "It's early." She trailed off when she saw the huge hoofprint plastered across the pink mare's chest. She panicked briefly. "Dear Celestia, did death touch you?" she shrieked. "Is that black plague? Don't come any closer. You could be contagious." She leapt to put a hoof over her muzzle, and Pinkamena shoved a rock into her doorframe before she could slam it shut. "It's mud," Pinkamena said simply, "and it needs to be measured by some pony that knows fancy mathematics." This seemed to calm Twilight down, and with the fresh adrenaline she was much more awake. "This is important, Twilight," the pink mare said, gesturing to her chest. I need size, age, anything you can get out of this print." "What for?" Twilight said, leaning and already mentally making a list of the instruments she would need to do such a thing. "It's a hoof print." "I'm very close to finding out who Death is," Pinkamena said. "Is this his?" Twilight shrieked, wondering if there was a nasty bruise or broken bones beneath the mud. "Did he buck you in the chest?" "It's for comparison." Pinkamena finally shouldered past her, growing impatient. "Let's get measuring," she said officially, "before the pinky sense goes off and I have to rush away." Twilight nodded firmly, the door of her lab wrenching itself open. Both mares went downstairs. Spike would awaken almost an hour later, having no idea where any pony had gone.